In the heart of Kansas City, on a bitter January evening in 1935, when the wind howled through the streets like the voice of something ancient and hungry, a man who would become known only as Roland T. Owen checked into the Hotel President's Room 1046, and what followed remains one of the most chilling and inexplicable mysteries in American history, a tale so disturbing that even 90 years later, investigators find themselves unable to piece together what truly happened in that cursed room, unable to explain why a young man was tortured to death in the middle of a busy hotel, while dozens of people moved through the halls just feet away, unable to answer the question that haunts every true crime enthusiast who learns of this case. Who was he who killed him, and why did it happen in such a strange, theatrical, almost ritualistic manner that suggests something far more complex than a simple murder? The stranger arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back, no luggage, no identification, no toiletries or personal items of any kind, just a quiet demeanor and an unsettling request that his door remain unlocked at all times, a detail that would haunt everyone who learned of it, because what kind of person checks into a hotel and specifically asks that their room be left accessible to anyone who might want to enter? What kind of person invites such vulnerability, such danger? Unless they're expecting someone, unless they've been told to do exactly that by someone, they fear more than they fear strangers walking into their room in the middle of the night. The Hotel President itself was a grand establishment in its day, 10 stories of brick and limestone rising above the intersection of Baltimore Avenue and 12th Street, catering to businessmen and travelers passing through Kansas City, a city that in 1935 was still reeling from the Great Depression, but remained an important hub of commerce and transportation, a crossroads where people from all over the country converged, made deals, kept secrets, and sometimes, as in this case, died mysterious deaths that would perplex investigators for generations to come. The hotel's lobby was decorated in the opulent style of the era, with marble floors and crystal chandeliers and plush furniture where guests could sit and read newspapers or conduct quiet business conversations. And the staff prided themselves on discretion, on not asking too many questions, on providing service with a smile and maintaining the privacy that travelers valued, which meant that when a young man checked in with no luggage and a fake name, no one thought much of it. Because the Depression had taught people to mind their own business and be grateful for paying customers, regardless of how unusual they might seem. Roland T. Owen, though that name would later prove to be as fictitious as everything else about this case, approached the front desk at approximately 7:30 p.m. on January 2, 1935, and the night clerk Randy Probst would later recall that there was nothing particularly memorable about the man, nothing that stood out or raised immediate alarm, just an ordinary-looking fellow in his mid-20s, perhaps 30 at the oldest, dressed in a dark suit that had seen better days. With brown hair neatly combed and a face that Probst described as pleasant enough, but forgettable, the kind of face that would disappear in a crowd, and maybe that was intentional. Maybe this young man had cultivated that very ordinariness as a kind of camouflage, or maybe he was just unlucky enough to have generic features that made him difficult to remember, difficult to describe, difficult to identify later when his broken body lay in the morgue and police desperately needed someone, anyone, to come forward and say they knew him. He signed the register in a neat, careful hand, writing Roland T. Owen, and giving an address in Los Angeles that would later turn out to be a vacant lot. And when Probst asked if he had any luggage, Owen shook his head and said his bags had been lost in transit but would be arriving the next day, a plausible enough excuse in an era when luggage did sometimes go astray, and Probst accepted this explanation without question, took the man's money, he paid cash for one night in advance, and handed him the key to room 1046 on the 4th floor. As Owen turned to walk toward the elevator, Probst called after him to ask if he needed help finding his room, and Owen turned back with what the clerk later described as the saddest smile I ever saw, like he knew something terrible was going to happen and had already accepted it, and said no thank you, he could find it himself, and then he disappeared into the elevator, and Probst went back to his paperwork, not knowing that he'd just checked in a man who would be dead within 48 hours, tortured so brutally that the medical examiner would struggle to determine exactly what had been done to him, and in what order. Room 1046 was a modest accommodation, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable, with a single bed covered in a floral bedspread, a dresser with a mirror, a small closet, a chair positioned by the window, and a bathroom with a tub and sink, the kind of room that thousands of travelers had stayed in over the years without incident, the kind of room where nothing should have happened except peaceful sleep and morning departures, but something about this particular room, or perhaps something about this particular moment in time, would transform it into a chamber of horrors, a place where evil manifested in its purest form and left behind a mystery that would never be solved. The window looked out over Baltimore Avenue, offering a view of the street below where cars passed and pedestrians hurried through the cold evening, And if Owen stood at that window and looked down, he would have seen normal life continuing, oblivious to whatever darkness he was about to face. And perhaps he did stand there, perhaps he spent his first evening in room 1046 looking out at the world, and wondering if he would ever see another sunrise, if he would ever walk those streets again. If anyone would remember him after he was gone, or if he would simply disappear as if he'd never existed at all. The hotel maid, Mary Soptic, would be the first to sense something terribly wrong when she entered room 1046 the next morning, January 3rd, at approximately 9:30 a.m., to clean and refresh the room as was her daily routine. Mary was a hard-working woman in her 40s, a Czech immigrant who had come to America seeking a better life and had found steady employment at the hotel President, and she took pride in her work, in making sure every room was spotless and welcoming, and in her years of service she'd seen all manner of guests and situations, from newlyweds on their honeymoons to businessmen conducting affairs to families traveling cross-country, and she'd learned to be observant without being intrusive. To notice things without commenting on them, to provide service while respecting privacy. But when she knocked on the door of room 1046 that morning and called out, "Housekeeping," receiving no response, she used her passkey to enter and found something that immediately struck her as deeply wrong. The man she would later identify as Roland Owen was sitting in the room's only chair, positioned near the window, but the curtains were drawn tight against the bright winter sun outside, plunging the room into almost complete darkness, and he hadn't turned on any of the lights. Just sitting there in the gloom, motionless, and when her eyes adjusted and she could make out his form, she saw that he was staring straight ahead at nothing, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. Mary stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain whether to proceed or leave, because there was something about the scene that felt off, something about the way this man sat in darkness when there was light available, something about the tension in his posture that suggested he was either terrified or concentrating intensely on something she couldn't see. And when she cleared her throat and asked if he needed anything, if she should come back later, he didn't turn his head. Didn't acknowledge her presence for several long seconds that seemed to stretch into minutes, and then finally, slowly, he turned to face her, and she could see that his face was pale, almost grey, with dark circles under his eyes as if he hadn't slept, and his voice when he finally spoke was flat and emotionless, almost mechanical, as if he were speaking words that had been given to him rather than his own thoughts. "No, thank you, I don't need anything." Mary later told police that she'd felt a chill run down her spine in that moment, not because of anything the man had said or done specifically, but because of what he hadn't done. He hadn't apologized for the darkness, hadn't explained why he was sitting like that, hadn't made any of the small talk or polite gestures that guests typically made when caught in their rooms during cleaning time, and there was something in his eyes, or perhaps in the absence of something in his eyes, that made her deeply uncomfortable, as if she were looking at a man who had already given up on life, who was just waiting for the inevitable to arrive. She backed out of the room, closing the door softly, and continued with her other rooms. But all morning she found herself thinking about the man in 1046, wondering what could make someone sit alone in the dark like that, wondering if she should say something to the manager, though what would she say? That a guest was sitting in his own room with the lights off, which wasn't a crime or even particularly unusual, just unsettling in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She decided to check on him again later, to see if his mood had improved or if he needed anything, because despite the unease he'd caused her, Mary was a kind woman who worried about people, who wanted to help if she could, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this particular guest was in some kind of trouble, though she had no idea what kind or how to help him. When Mary returned to room 1046 later that afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., she found the door slightly ajar, which was unusual because most guests kept their doors closed for privacy. And as she approached to knock, she heard voices inside, two men, she was certain, though the door muffled their words enough that she couldn't make out what they were saying. Only the tone, which was sharp and argumentative, one voice rising in what sounded like protest or pleading, the other responding in harsh, clipped syllables that conveyed anger or perhaps threat. Mary hesitated, her hand raised to knock, because she didn't want to interrupt what might be a private business discussion or a personal argument. But she also had a job to do, and the rooms needed to be serviced, and the door was open, which might mean the guest wanted service after all. So she knocked firmly and called out "housekeeping" in her cheerful professional voice, and immediately the voices inside stopped, cut off as abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch. And the sudden silence was somehow worse than the argument had been, more ominous, laden with tension and unspoken threat. After a moment that felt much longer than it probably was, she heard footsteps approaching the door, and then it opened just a crack, just wide enough for her to see one eye and part of a face. Owen's face, she recognized, though it looked different now. The pallor had given way to a flush, and there was sweat on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the hotel, and his eye, the one she could see through the narrow opening, was wide and frightened. Darting past her to look down the hallway as if checking for someone else, and when he spoke his voice was tight and strained, nothing like the flat monotone of the morning. "I don't need any service, thank you please just," and here he paused, swallowed hard, glanced behind him into the room where she couldn't see, "Just come back tomorrow, please." And before Mary could respond, before she could ask if everything was all right or if he needed help, he closed the door firmly, and she heard the lock click into place. And she stood there in the hallway for a long moment, her cleaning cart beside her, trying to decide if what she'd witnessed warranted reporting to someone, but reporting what exactly? That a guest had an argument with a visitor and didn't want housekeeping service that day, neither of which was particularly alarming in itself. Though combined with the morning's strange encounter, and the look of fear she'd seen in that one visible eye, it added up to something that troubled her deeply, made her wish she could see through walls, could know what was happening inside room 1046, could somehow prevent whatever her instincts told her was going to happen. Mary Soptic would carry the guilt of that moment for the rest of her life, wondering if she'd called the manager right then, if she'd insisted someone check on the guest in 1046. If she'd trusted her instincts instead of deferring to professional protocol and respect for guest privacy, could she have prevented what happened next? Could she have saved a life? Or was it already too late? Was the machinery of death already in motion, in such a way that nothing she did would have mattered? These are the questions that haunt witnesses to tragedy, the terrible weight of hindsight, the knowledge that they stood at a junction where one choice might have altered everything, but they made a different choice, the sensible choice, the choice that respected boundaries and didn't cause unnecessary alarm, and someone died because of it, or someone died regardless of it, and they'll never know which, and the not knowing is perhaps worse than any certain answer could be. Mary returned to her duties, serviced the other rooms on the 4th floor, went home to her family that evening with a vague sense of disquiet that she couldn't quite shake, and tried not to think about the man in room 1046, though his frightened eye kept appearing in her mind's eye, along with the memory of those angry voices cut off into suspicious silence. And she slept poorly that night, troubled by dreams she couldn't quite remember upon waking, and when she returned to work the next morning. January 4th, she would discover exactly how right her instincts had been, how justified her worry, though the reality would be so much worse than anything she'd imagined that it would give her nightmares for decades to come. That night, the night of January 3rd into the early morning of January 4th, other guests at the Hotel President reported hearing strange sounds emanating from room 1046, though none of them realized at the time that what they were hearing was a man being tortured to death, that the sounds were not furniture being moved, or a late-night argument, or couples being intimate, or any of the normal hotel sounds that guests learn to tune out. But rather the soundtrack to a murder so brutal and prolonged that it suggested a level of malice and planning that went far beyond a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. Mrs. Della Ferguson, staying in room 1044 directly adjacent to 1046, told police that she'd heard furniture scraping across the floor around 10:30 p.m., a sound that had annoyed her because she'd been trying to sleep, and she'd considered calling the front desk to complain but had decided against it, figuring that whoever was in the next room would eventually settle down. And after about 15 minutes the scraping had indeed stopped, replaced by a different sound. Something she initially thought was water running in the bathroom, a steady sound that was almost soothing in its regularity, and she drifted off to sleep only to be awakened sometime later. She couldn't be sure of the exact time, but she thought it was around midnight, by what she described as muffled thumping, like someone hitting a pillow repeatedly, but harder, more violent, and I remember thinking it was a strange thing to hear and wondering what could make a sound like that. She'd put her pillow over her head to block out the noise and eventually fallen back asleep, and when police asked her if she'd heard any voices, any cries for help, she said no, nothing like that, just the furniture scraping and the thumping and at one point what might have been a low groan, though she couldn't be certain because the walls were thick and the sounds were distorted, and anyway, people made all sorts of noises in hotels. And you learn not to pay too much attention if you wanted to get any sleep at all. Mr. and Mrs. Harold Pike, staying in room 1048 directly across the hall from 1046, had a more disturbing account, though even they didn't realize the significance of what they'd heard until after the body was discovered. Mrs. Pike told investigators that she was a light sleeper, always had been, and the slightest sound would wake her. And on the night of January 3rd, she'd been awakened multiple times by sounds from the room across the hall. First by footsteps in the corridor, heavy footsteps that paced back and forth for what seemed like a long time, maybe 20 minutes or more, and she'd looked at the clock and seen it was 11:45 p.m., and she'd wondered who was packing like that and why. But her husband had told her to ignore it and go back to sleep, and she tried, but then around 1:30 a.m. she'd heard voices, at least 2 different male voices, one of them raised in what sounded like anger, the other responding in quieter tones that she couldn't make out, and the argument had gone on for several minutes before subsiding into silence. Then around 2:00 a.m., she'd heard the sound that would haunt her forever, the sound that when she looked back on it later made her physically ill with the realization of what she'd been hearing. a sound she described to police as like someone trying to scream through a gag, muffled and desperate, and then a thud, and then silence, such complete silence that it was almost worse than the sounds had been, because the silence felt final, if that makes any sense. Like whatever had been making noise had been stopped, permanently. Mrs. Pike had sat up in bed, her heart pounding, wondering if she should call the front desk or knock on the door across the hall. But her husband, irritated at being awakened repeatedly, had insisted that it was probably just drunk guests or people having an argument or any of a dozen other explanations that didn't require them to get involved. And anyway, it was now quiet, so whatever it was had resolved itself, and they should just go back to sleep. Mrs. Pike had lain awake for another hour, listening intently for any further sounds from room 1046. But there had been none, just silence, and eventually exhaustion had claimed her, and she'd fallen into a troubled sleep filled with nightmares she couldn't quite remember. And when morning came and police knocked on their door to ask if they'd heard anything unusual the previous night, she burst into tears, knowing that her instinct to check on the source of those sounds had been correct. And that her failure to act, or rather, her acquiescence to her husband's insistence that they not get involved, might have cost someone their life, though as the police would assure her later, probably too late by then, probably nothing she could have done would have changed the outcome, though of course there was no way to know for certain, and that uncertainty would trouble both the Pikes for the rest of their lives. The night clerk, Robert Lane, who had taken over from Randy Propst at 11:00 p.m., reported receiving a noise complaint from a guest on the fourth floor at approximately 10:45 p.m. A Mr. Jensen in room 1040 had called down to say there was a disturbance, voices raised in anger, and could someone please ask them to keep it down, and Lane had immediately called room 1046. Knowing from experience that most noise complaints on the fourth floor originated from that area of the hotel. The phone had rung several times before someone answered, and Lane had identified himself and politely asked if they could please keep the noise down as other guests were trying to sleep, and the voice that answered, male, Lane was certain, though he couldn't be more specific than that, had said yes of course, sorry about that, it won't happen again, and the voice had sounded normal enough, perhaps slightly strained or breathless but nothing that raised any red flags, and Lane had thanked him and hung up. Noting the call in his log as he was required to do, writing 10:47 p.m. noise complaint, room 1046, resolved, never imagining that at that very moment, or perhaps just minutes before, something terrible was happening or had already happened in that room, that the voice he'd spoken to might have belonged to Killer rather than to Roland Owen, or perhaps Owen had answered the phone himself with a killer standing right behind him, forcing him to reassure the hotel staff that everything was fine when in fact nothing was fine, when in fact he was already injured, already dying, already beyond any help that might have saved him. At approximately 1:15 a.m., the night janitor, Louis Armstrong, no relation to the famous musician, a coincidence he'd explained so many times he was tired of it, was cleaning the hallway on the fourth floor when he noticed that the door to room 1046 was slightly ajar, just an inch or two, enough that he could see a sliver of the room's interior, though not enough to make out any details. This struck him as odd because it was very late for a door to be open, even slightly, and hotel policy required that doors be kept closed for security reasons, so he approached intending to knock and politely ask the guest to close their door, but as he got closer he saw movement inside the room, a shadow crossing in front of the light, and he paused, not wanting to intrude if someone was awake and perhaps about to close the door themselves. He stood there for a moment, mop in hand, watching the crack in the door, and he saw the shadow move again, this time seeming to bend down toward the floor, and he heard a sound that he later described as rustling, like someone going through papers or maybe cloth, I couldn't tell which. And then suddenly, abruptly, the door swung closed and he heard the lock click into place, and the speed of it, the finality of it, something about it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Made him feel that he'd witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see, though he couldn't have said what exactly he'd seen or why it disturbed him. Louis Armstrong was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs, but he would later tell police that in that moment, standing in the fourth-floor hallway at 1:15 in the morning with his mop and his cleaning cart, he'd had the distinct and powerful feeling that something evil was on the other side of that door, something that had seen him through the crack, something that had closed the door not just for privacy, but to hide something. To conceal evidence of something that couldn't be allowed to be seen, and he'd actually taken a step backward, away from room 1046, his instinct telling him to get away from that door, to finish his cleaning elsewhere and come back to this area later, or not at all. He'd pushed his cart down the hallway, glancing back over his shoulder at room 1046, and he'd noticed something he hadn't seen before, a thin line of light under the door, and as he watched, that line of light flickered, as if someone inside had passed between the light source and the door, moving around the room, and Louis had hurried away, uncomfortable in a way he couldn't articulate, certain that something was wrong but equally certain that it wasn't his place to investigate. that hotel guests were entitled to their privacy, even if they were doing strange things at odd hours, even if they gave him feelings of unease that he couldn't explain. He'd finished his cleaning on the other floors and had returned to the fourth floor around 3:00 a.m. to vacuum the hallway, and by then the light under the door of room 1046 had been extinguished, the room dark and quiet, and Louis had vacuumed as quickly as he could, pushing the machine past room 1046 without pausing, still feeling that inexplicable wrongness emanating from that particular door. And when he'd finished, he'd been relieved to leave the fourth floor behind, to descend to the lobby and his normal duties, putting room 1046 out of his mind as best he could, though images of that closing door, that flickering light, would surface in his memory at odd moments for days afterward, until he heard about the murder and realized that what he'd witnessed had been the killer, still in the room, still at the scene of his crime. Perhaps even at that very moment, cleaning up evidence, or arranging the body, or doing whatever it is that killers do after they've destroyed a human life. The morning of January 4th dawned cold and grey, with fresh snow beginning to fall over Kansas City, covering the streets in a clean white blanket that would soon be churned into brown slush by traffic, and Mary Soptic arrived at the hotel president at 8:00 a.m. to begin her shift, still troubled by her encounters with the guest in room 1046 the previous day, but determined to approach the room with professionalism and courtesy, to offer service without being intrusive. To respect whatever privacy the guest required, while also making sure he had fresh towels and a clean bathroom, and all the other small comforts that hotels provided. She began her rounds on the fourth floor, working her way down the hallway with her cart, cleaning rooms that had been vacated by guests checking out, refreshing rooms whose occupants were out for the day, skipping rooms whose "do not disturb" signs indicated that the guests were sleeping or otherwise didn't want to be bothered. And when she reached room 1046 at approximately 9:15 a.m., she noted that there was no sign on the door, no indication that service wasn't wanted. So she knocked firmly and called out housekeeping in her clear, professional voice, and when no one answered after several seconds, she knocked again, louder this time, and called out again, and when there was still no response, she assumed the guest must have gone out, perhaps for breakfast or for an early morning appointment, and she used her passkey to unlock the door, pushed it open, and stepped into room 1046. And what she saw there would haunt her for the remaining 43 years of her life, would appear in her nightmares regularly, would make her cry at unexpected moments when the memory surfaced unbidden, would make her question her faith and her understanding of human nature and her belief that the world was fundamentally a good place, where people mostly tried to do right by each other. The room was a scene of carnage that defied easy comprehension, that took her brain several long seconds to process, because what she was seeing was so far outside the realm of normal experience that her mind initially refused to accept it, tried to find alternative explanations, tried to make sense of the impossible, until finally, inevitably, reality asserted itself and she understood exactly what she was looking at. A man, the same man who had sat in darkness, the same man whose frightened eye had peered at her through the crack in the door, lying on the bed on his back, arms at his sides, and at first glance he might have been sleeping except that his eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling, and there was blood, so much blood, soaked into the sheets and the mattress, and pooled on the floor beside the bed, blood that had dried to a dark brown color that looked almost black in the dim light filtering through the curtains. And the man's face, oh God, his face was swollen and discolored, barely recognizable as human, and Mary stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still on the doorknob, her cleaning cart abandoned in the hallway, her mouth open in a silent scream because no sound would come, her entire body rigid with horror and shock. And she stood there for what might have been 10 seconds or might have been 10 minutes, time having lost all meaning in the face of such atrocity, until finally her paralysis broke and she stumbled backward out of the room, pulling the door closed behind her with trembling hands, and she ran down the hallway toward the stairs, her footsteps echoing off the walls, running faster than she'd run in years, desperate to get away from room 1046, desperate to find help, to tell someone. To make someone else see what she'd seen so she wouldn't be alone with that terrible knowledge, that terrible image burned into her retinas, that terrible understanding that something monstrous had happened just feet away from where dozens of people had been sleeping peacefully, that evil had walked the halls of the hotel president and left death in its wake. Mary burst into the manager's office on the ground floor, interrupting a meeting between assistant manager William Farber and a linen supplier, and she was hyperventilating, unable to form coherent words, just gasping room 1046, room 1046, oh God, room 1046, over and over until Farber managed to calm her down enough to understand that something terrible had happened. Someone was hurt or dead in room 1046. And Farber immediately called the police, while sending one of the bellhops to the fourth floor to secure the room and make sure no one entered or left. And within minutes the hotel lobby was filled with police officers and detectives converging on the scene, their shoes tracking snow across the marble floors, their voices low and urgent as they received their assignments and headed for the elevator, and Mary sat in the lobby in a chair someone had brought her. Wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, sipping water someone had pressed into her shaking hands, while around her the normal business of the hotel ground to a halt, replaced by the grim machinery of a murder investigation, the taking of statements, the securing of evidence, the notification of supervisors and coroners, and all the officials who needed to be involved when a human life had been violently ended. Detective Buck Traver was the first investigator to enter room 1046 after the uniformed officers had secured the scene, and Buck Traver was not a man easily shocked or disturbed. He'd been a cop in Kansas City for 15 years, had worked homicides for 7 of those years, had seen every variety of human violence and depravity that a mid-sized American city in the depths of the Depression could produce. Had seen gunshot victims and stabbing victims and victims of domestic violence and victims of gang warfare and victims of robberies gone wrong. Had seen bodies left in alleys and bodies dumped in the Missouri River and bodies buried in shallow grave in wooded areas outside the city limits. Had developed the kind of professional detachment that allows police officers to do their jobs without being emotionally destroyed by the things they witness. But when Buck Traver entered room 1046 on the morning of January 4, 1935, he felt his stomach lurch in a way it hadn't in years, felt his carefully maintained detachment crack and threatened to crumble, because what had been done to the man on that bed went beyond the usual categories of murder, beyond the familiar patterns of violence motivated by greed, or violence motivated by passion, or violence motivated by mental illness, and entered into territory that suggested something darker, something more deliberate and controlled and ultimately more terrifying, because this wasn't violence as explosion, this was violence as craft, violence as process, violence inflicted over time with care and attention and terrible purpose. The victim, Traver couldn't yet think of him as Roland Owen because he had no way of knowing if that name was real, and something about the whole setup suggested it probably wasn't. Lay on his back on the bed, and Traver noted immediately that the position looked arranged, not natural, as if someone had carefully placed the body in that position after death, straightening the limbs, crossing the hands over the abdomen in a pose that was almost peaceful if you didn't look at the damage that had been done. If you didn't see the massive head trauma that had caved in the right side of the skull, if you didn't notice the ligature marks on the wrists that indicated the victim had been bound during at least part of his ordeal, if you ignored the defensive wounds on the hands and forearms that showed he'd tried to protect himself from the blows that had ultimately killed him. The bedsheets were saturated with blood, so much blood that it was hard to believe one human body could contain that much, and the blood had soaked through the mattress to the bed frame, had dripped down onto the floor creating a dark puddle that had spread several feet from the bed, before coagulating into a sticky congealed mass that pulled at the soles of Traver's shoes as he carefully circled the scene, examining it from all angles. Committing every detail to memory, because he'd learned long ago that crime scenes revealed secrets that weren't always obvious at first glance, that patterns emerged only after careful consideration, that the devil, as they said, was in the details. Traver's trained eye took in the room systematically, cataloguing everything, looking for things that were present and things that were absent, both equally important in understanding what had happened here. The curtains were still drawn, keeping the room dim even though it was now mid-morning. The single chair was positioned near the door, moved from its usual spot by the window, and there were scuff marks on the floor suggesting it had been dragged rather than carried. The bathroom door stood open, and through it Traver could see the sink, and even from this distance he could tell it had been recently used, probably for cleaning, because there were water droplets still visible on the porcelain and a faint pink stain around the drain that suggested blood had been washed away. The room's telephone sat on the nightstand beside the bed, its cord wrapped neatly around the base, and Traver made a mental note to check with the hotel's switchboard operator to see if any calls had been made from this room. On the dresser sat a few personal items, a tie pin, a hairbrush, a small bottle that might have been cologne or medicine, but no wallet, no identification, nothing with a name or address, which in itself was suspicious because even travelers who carried minimal belongings usually had some form of identification on them, if only for the practical necessity of cashing checks or proving who they were in situations that required it. But it was the note that caught Traver's attention and held it, the note that would become one of the most discussed and analyzed pieces of evidence in the case, the note that suggested premeditation and planning, and a scenario far more complex than a random attack or a crime of opportunity. Lying on the dresser, propped against the mirror so it would be immediately visible to anyone entering the room, was a piece of hotel president stationery with a message written in pencil. The handwriting rushed and somewhat shaky but still legible. "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." Just 7 words, but those 7 words opened up entire universes of speculation and theory, Who was Don? Was it another person, perhaps an accomplice or a victim, or was it short for Donald, possibly the victim's real name, or was it a code name, a pseudonym used by someone involved in this affair? Who had written the note? The victim himself, leaving a message for someone he expected to return, or someone else, perhaps the killer, writing in the victim's presence. Perhaps even forcing him to watch as instructions were laid out for some unknown person named Don. What was the purpose of the note? Was it genuine, an actual communication intended for an actual person named Don, or was it misdirection, a false clue planted deliberately to confuse investigators and send them chasing phantoms? And the timing implied in the message, the 15 minutes, suggested that when the note was written, the writer expected to return within that time frame, which meant that either the writer did return and this was all part of some planned sequence of events, or the writer never returned and something had disrupted their plans, and in either case, what had those plans been? What had been the ultimate goal of whoever wrote that note? Trevor carefully collected the note, placing it in an evidence envelope, and continued his examination of the room, working his way from the dresser to the closet, which stood open and empty. No clothes, no luggage, nothing at all, confirming what the front desk had said about the victim checking in without any baggage. The bathroom yielded more evidence of cleanup. One of the hotel towels was still damp and had a faint pink stain that would later test positive for blood. The tub showed signs of recent use, with water marks and a few strands of hair caught in the drain. The toilet had been flushed, but not recently, suggesting it had been used sometime during the night, but not immediately before the room was abandoned. Trevor noted all of this in his notebook, his pencil moving quickly across the page, recording observations that might mean everything or nothing, because at this stage of an investigation you couldn't know what would turn out to be important, so you documented everything and sorted it out later, separating the significant from the coincidental, the clues from the red herrings. The medical examiner, Dr. Harold Flanders, arrived at 10:30 a.m. and conducted his preliminary examination of the body right there in room 1046, carefully documenting injuries before the corpse was moved to the morgue for a more thorough autopsy. Dr. Flanders was a meticulous man, precise in his observations and conservative in his conclusions, not given to speculation or jumping to conclusions without solid evidence, and as he examined the victim's body, turning it carefully, photographing wounds from multiple angles, taking measurements and notes, even his professional composure was tested by the extent and nature of the injuries. The cause of death appeared to be massive cranial trauma. The skull had been fractured in at least 3 places, possibly more, suggesting repeated blows with a heavy blunt object, possibly a hammer or a tire iron or a baseball bat, something solid and dense enough to crack bone, and the force required to inflict these injuries indicated that the attacker was either very strong or very determined, or perhaps both. Raining blows down on the victim's head, with enough force to drive fragments of skull bone into the brain tissue beneath, causing hemorrhaging and swelling that would have led to unconsciousness and eventually death. But the head trauma, horrific as it was, wasn't the only injury, and it was the other injuries, the ones that hadn't directly caused death, that disturbed Dr. Flanders most because they suggested torture, systematic infliction of pain over an extended period, which transformed this from a straightforward murder, horrible enough in itself, into something that spoke to a depth of malice and cruelty that was genuinely frightening in its implications. The victim's wrists bore ligature marks, deep grooves in the skin that indicated he'd been bound tightly with rope or cord for a significant period of time, and the marks had the kind of depth and bruising that suggested he'd struggled against his bonds, pulled and twisted trying to free himself, rubbing his skin raw in the process, and Dr. Flanders could see that some of the ligature wounds had bled, meaning the victim had been alive when they were inflicted, conscious and struggling. Trapped in this room with no way to escape, no way to call for help, knowing that he was going to die and unable to do anything to prevent it. The victim's hands bore defensive wounds, cuts and bruises on the palms and backs of the hands, fingers with torn fingernails where he'd tried to grab or deflect the weapon being used against him. And these wounds told a story of a man fighting for his life, trying desperately to ward off the blows that were coming at him. And Dr. Flanders, who had seen many defensive wounds in his career, noted that these were particularly extensive, suggesting a sustained assault. Not a quick sudden attack, but rather an extended physical struggle during which the victim had fought back as hard as he could, though ultimately it hadn't been enough. Ultimately he'd been overpowered and restrained and killed. But it was the burns that really disturbed Dr. Flanders, the small circular burns on the victim's chest and abdomen, perhaps a dozen of them, each one approximately the size of a cigarette end, and that's almost certainly what they were, cigarette burns inflicted deliberately while the victim was restrained and unable to escape. And this was torture in its purest sense, pain inflicted not as a means to an end but as an end in itself, or perhaps as a means of extracting information. Of forcing the victim to reveal something he knew, though what information a telephone operator from Birmingham, Alabama, if that's indeed who he was, could possibly have that would warrant this level of brutality was completely unclear. The burns showed different stages of healing, or rather non-healing, with some appearing fresher than others, suggesting they might have been inflicted over a period of hours, and Dr. Flanders, calculating based on the body's temperature and the degree of rigor mortis present, estimated that death had occurred sometime between midnight and 3:00 a.m., which meant that if the burns had been inflicted over several hours, the torture must have begun in the evening of January 3rd. Perhaps as early as 8:00 or 9:00 p.m., which aligned with the reports from other guests of strange sounds and arguments coming from room 1046 during those hours. The autopsy, conducted later that afternoon at the city morgue, revealed additional details that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The victim's stomach contents indicated he'd eaten a light meal several hours before death, something simple like soup or crackers, but there was also evidence of alcohol consumption, though not enough to indicate serious intoxication, perhaps just a drink or two, and this raised questions about whether he'd been drinking willingly, perhaps trying to steady his nerves before whatever he knew was coming, or whether he'd been given alcohol by someone else. Perhaps to make him more compliant or to impair his judgment. The victim's lungs showed no sign of asphyxiation, ruling out strangulation or suffocation as contributing factors to death, but there were petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, small burst blood vessels that can indicate extreme stress or pressure, and while this could be explained by the head trauma, it could also suggest that at some point during his ordeal, the victim had experienced extreme physical or emotional distress, perhaps had been choked or suffocated briefly, though not fatally. Perhaps as part of the torture, another way to inflict fear and pain without causing immediate deaths. One detail from the autopsy that Dr. Flanders found particularly puzzling was the relative lack of blood on the victim's clothing. The man's shirt and trousers, which he'd still been wearing when found, had some blood stains, but far less than you'd expect given the massive head trauma and the amount of blood that had soaked into the bed, and this suggested that some of the clothing might have been removed during the assault and then replaced afterward. Or that the victim had been positioned in such a way during the attack that his clothes were partially protected from the blood, though why anyone would bother with such niceties while committing murder was difficult to understand. The victim's shoes were placed neatly beside the bed, not kicked off carelessly as one might expect, but positioned side by side with the laces still tied, as if someone had carefully removed them and set them aside, and this detail, small as it was, added to the growing sense that this crime scene had been staged somehow, arranged with care. That nothing here was accidental or spontaneous, but rather everything had been carefully considered and executed according to some plan that made sense to the killer, but remained opaque to the investigators trying to understand it. Detective Travers spent the afternoon of January 4th interviewing hotel staff and guests, trying to piece together a timeline of events, trying to identify who had been in room 1046 during the crucial hours between the victim's check-in on January 2nd and the discovery of his body on the morning of January 4th. The front desk clerk, Randy Probst, provided the basic information about the check-in, describing Roland T. Owen as unremarkable, forgettable, just another guest in a hotel that saw hundreds of guests every week, and Probst couldn't recall anything unusual about the man's demeanor or behavior, except perhaps that he'd seemed quiet, reserved, not unfriendly, but not particularly talkative either, just going through the motions of checking in and getting his room key and heading upstairs. Mary Soptic, the maid, still shaken from her discovery of the body, provided her account of the two encounters she'd had with the man in 1046, the strange scene of him sitting in darkness on the morning of January 3rd, and then the even stranger and more disturbing encounter that afternoon when he'd opened the door just a crack with someone else clearly present in the room, and she kept apologizing, saying she should have known something was wrong, she should have reported it. She should have insisted on checking to make sure he was okay, and Travers had to reassure her repeatedly that she'd done nothing wrong, that there was no way she could have known what was happening, that hotel maids weren't trained to be detectives, and couldn't be expected to recognize danger in every unusual situation they encountered. The other guests who had heard sounds from room 1046 provided their accounts, each one adding another piece to the puzzle, but none of them providing a clear picture of what had actually happened. Mrs. Ferguson's description of furniture scraping and muffled thumping, Mr. and Mrs. Pike's report of angry voices, and that terrible sound like someone trying to scream through a gag, the night janitor Louis Armstrong's unsettling encounter with the ajar door, and the sense of wrongness he'd felt, the night clerk Robert Lane's noise complaint call to the room, and the normal-sounding voice that had answered and promised to keep quiet. Travers wrote all of this down, underlining significant details, drawing arrows between related pieces of information, trying to construct a narrative that made sense, but the narrative kept fragmenting, kept refusing to cohere into a single coherent story, because there were too many gaps, too many unknowns, too many questions that no one could answer. Who else had been in that room? How many people? When had they arrived and when had they left? Had anyone seen them? Could anyone describe them? Did they have a legitimate reason for being there, or were they the killers? And if they were the killers, what possible motive could they have had for such an elaborately brutal murder? The hotel switchboard operator, a young woman named Patricia Morse, provided what would turn out to be one of the most intriguing pieces of information in the entire investigation. She reported that room 1046 had received several telephone calls during the 2 days between check-in and the discovery of the body, and had also made several outgoing calls, though unfortunately the technology and procedures of the era meant that detailed records of these calls weren't kept. Patricia remembered that the calls had started on the evening of January 2nd, just a few hours after Roland Owen had checked in, and she'd connected at least 3 or 4 incoming calls to room 1046 that evening, all from local numbers, though she hadn't noted what numbers specifically, because she wasn't required to log that information for local calls. She remembered one call in particular, because the man calling had seemed frustrated when he first asked for room 1046, as if he'd expected someone to be there but hadn't gotten an answer, and he'd called back twice more within the space of 15 minutes before finally getting through, and Patricia had wondered at the time what was so urgent that someone would keep calling repeatedly like that, but it was not her place to question guests' business. So she'd simply connected the calls and moved on to her other duties. On the morning of January 3rd, according to Patricia's recollection, there had been more calls to room 1046, including one lengthy call that had lasted at least 20 minutes, though again she had no record of where the call had come from or who it had been with, and there had also been at least 2 outgoing calls from room 1046, one in the mid-morning and one in the early afternoon, but again, no records existed of where those calls had been placed or who had answered them. Patricia did remember one odd thing about the outgoing calls, though. The voice she'd heard when she'd connected the second call hadn't sounded like the same voice she'd heard the previous evening. And while she couldn't be certain, because voices could sound different on the telephone, and she dealt with dozens of calls every hour and couldn't be expected to remember every voice she heard, she had the impression that 2 different men had made calls from room 1046, which suggested that Owen had had a visitor or visitors during his stay, someone who had used the room's telephone, someone who felt comfortable enough in that room to make personal phone calls. Traver made careful notes of all this, recognizing that the telephone calls could be crucial to understanding what had happened, but frustrated by the lack of detailed records, by the technological limitations of 1935 telephone systems that made it impossible to retrieve the information that in later decades would be routinely available to investigators. And he wondered who Owen had been calling, who had been calling him, what conversations had taken place over those telephone lines. What plans had been made, what threats had been issued, what final goodbyes had been said. The investigation into the identity of Roland T. Owen began immediately, with police checking missing persons reports, sending his description out to other law enforcement agencies, publishing his photograph in newspapers hoping someone would recognize him and come forward, but the initial responses were disappointing. Several people called in saying they thought they might know him, but in each case when they came to view the body they realized they'd been mistaken. The dead man wasn't their missing brother or nephew or son or friend, just someone who looked vaguely similar, and they left the morgue disappointed or relieved or both, and the dead man remained unidentified, remained a mystery, remained Roland T. Owen in the absence of any better name to call him. The address he'd given when checking in, a street address in Los Angeles, was quickly determined to be fake. It corresponded to a vacant lot in an industrial area, and inquiries to Los Angeles police revealed that no one by the name of Roland T. Owen lived anywhere in that city, or at least no one matching the victim's description. And while Owen was not an uncommon surname and Roland was not an unusual first name, the specific combination of Roland T. Owen produced no matches in any database the police could access, no driver's licenses, no bank accounts, no employment records, nothing at all to suggest that such a person actually existed, which meant it was almost certainly a pseudonym, a name chosen either randomly or for some specific reason that investigators could only guess at. The victim's physical description was circulated widely. White male, approximately 25-30 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighing approximately 145 pounds, he'd been thin, almost gaunt, which Dr. Flanders noted might indicate poor nutrition or chronic illness or simply a naturally slight build. Brown hair cut short and neatly styled, hazel eyes, no visible scars or birthmarks or tattoos except for the injuries inflicted during the attack that killed him. And teeth that were in poor condition with several cavities and one missing molar, which might have been useful for identification purposes if there had been dental records to compare them to, but of course there weren't because no one knew who he was, so his dental issues remained just another detail in a growing list of details that led nowhere. His fingerprints were taken and sent to the FBI's fingerprint database in Washington, D.C., but no matches came back, meaning he had no criminal record and had never been fingerprinted for any official purpose such as military service or government employment, which suggested that he'd lived a relatively conventional life, at least until whatever circumstances had brought him to Kansas City and to room 1046 and to his death. The victim's clothing offered another potential avenue of investigation, so every item was carefully examined. His suit was of moderate quality, neither expensive nor cheap, the kind that could be purchased at any mid-range department store in the country, and the label inside the jacket indicated it had been manufactured by Hart-Schaffner Marks, a major American clothing company that distributed its products through thousands of retail outlets, making it effectively untraceable to any specific location. His shirt was similarly generic, a white cotton dress shirt with a standard collar, the label removed, which seemed suspicious because why would someone remove the label from a shirt unless they were trying to prevent it from being traced back to its point of purchase? His trousers were dark grey wool, again of moderate quality, and again with the label removed, reinforcing the impression that someone, either the victim himself or someone else, had deliberately tried to make identification through clothing difficult or impossible. His underwear and socks were plain white cotton items that could have come from anywhere, with no distinguishing features whatsoever. And his shoes were brown leather Oxfords, well worn but still serviceable, manufactured by a company called Bostonian that, like Hart-Schaffner Marks, distributed through numerous retailers nationwide, making them untraceable. The fact that multiple labels had been removed from the victim's clothing suggested premeditation, a deliberate effort to obscure identity, but the question was who had removed those labels, and why had the victim done it himself, anticipating that he might end up dead and unidentifiable, trying to protect himself or someone else by making sure his identity couldn't be determined, or had someone else removed the labels after his death, trying to prevent identification for reasons of their own. Perhaps to delay discovery of the crime, perhaps to prevent connection to other crimes, perhaps for reasons that made sense only within some larger context that investigators didn't have access to. And if the victim had removed the labels himself, what did that say about his state of mind, about his understanding of the danger he was in, about his willingness to die anonymously rather than risk whatever consequences would come from being identified? Was he protecting family, protecting accomplices, protecting himself from being connected to past crimes or past associations, or was this all part of some elaborate plan that had gone wrong? Some scheme that had required him to be untraceable and anonymous. The items found in room 1046, sparse as they were examined for clues. The tie pin was a simple gold-colored piece, not particularly valuable, with no engravings or marks that might indicate where it had been purchased or who it might have belonged to. The hairbrush was similar, a plain black brush with natural bristles, used but not extensively. With a few strands of hair caught in the bristles that matched the victim's hair color and could potentially be used for identification if anyone came forward claiming to know him. The small bottle proved to contain aspirin, common pain relief tablets that could be purchased at any drugstore, and the bottle itself was a standard pharmacy container with no label or prescription information, suggesting the aspirin had been transferred from its original container or that the label had been removed. And the note, "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait remained the most intriguing and puzzling piece of evidence, analyzed by handwriting experts who concluded that it had been written by someone under stress, evidenced by the irregular letter formation and the inconsistent pressure applied to the pencil, but they could not determine whether it had been written by the victim or by someone else, as there were no other handwriting samples from the victim to compare it to, and the stress evident in the writing could indicate many things: fear, urgency, physical pain, time pressure, or simply poor handwriting skills. As the investigation stretched into its second and third days, Detective Traver found himself increasingly frustrated by the lack of solid leads, by the way every avenue of inquiry seemed to dead end, by the growing realization that whoever had committed this crime had done so with considerable care and planning, anticipating the investigation that would follow and taking steps to thwart it, removing or destroying evidence that might have led to identification of either the victim or the perpetrator. The hotel room had been wiped clean of fingerprints, not just casually cleaned but thoroughly and professionally wiped, with particular attention paid to surfaces that people typically touched: door handles, light switches, telephone, the faucets and fixtures in the bathroom. Even the window latch had been carefully cleaned, suggesting someone with knowledge of police procedure, someone who understood about fingerprints and their evidentiary value. Someone who had the presence of mind, even in the immediate aftermath of a brutal murder, to spend time carefully eliminating all traces of their presence in that room. This level of criminal sophistication suggested to Travor that he was dealing with professionals, not amateurs. Not someone who had killed in a moment of passion and then fled in panic, but rather someone, or more likely multiple people, who had planned this murder, executed it methodically, and then carefully covered their tracks. And this realization was deeply disturbing because it suggested that the murder of Roland Owen was not an isolated incident, but rather part of something larger. Some network of criminal activity or some organizational agenda that made the death of one anonymous young man necessary and justifiable in the killer's mind. On January 6, 2 days after the discovery of the body, the Kansas City Police Department held a press conference to release information about the case and to appeal to the public for help, and the local newspapers ran sensational headlines. Mystery man slain in hotel, brutal murder baffles police, who was Roland? The story captured public imagination in the way that mysterious crimes often do, offering a puzzle that readers could speculate about over breakfast or discuss with their coworkers or debate in barbershops and beauty parlors. Everyone having a theory, everyone certain they understood what had really happened, even though the people actually investigating the case remained baffled and frustrated. The press conference generated numerous tips and leads, people calling in to report suspicious individuals or suspicious behavior they'd witnessed in Kansas City around the time of the murder, people who claimed to have seen Roland Owen before his death, people who thought they might know who he really was, people who had theories about organized crime or communist conspiracies or romantic triangles gone deadly. And Travor and his fellow detectives dutifully followed up on every lead, no matter how implausible, because sometimes the most unlikely tip turned out to be the one that cracked a case wide open. But in this instance, none of the leads panned out, all of them leading to dead ends or mistaken identities or pure speculation, without any basis in fact. Then on January 10th, just as it seemed the case might remain forever unsolved, just as the newspapers were starting to move on to other stories and public attention was beginning to wane, a woman named Ruby Ogletree walked into the Kansas City Police Department and asked to see the body of the man who had been murdered in room 1046, saying she believed he might be her son Donald, who had left Birmingham, Alabama, several months earlier and whom she hadn't heard from since. And when she was taken to the morgue and shown the body, she positively identified him, weeping as she looked at his battered face, touching his cold hand and saying, "Yes, yes, that's my Donald, that's my boy. I'd know him anywhere despite what they've done to him." And suddenly the mystery man had a name, had a history, had a mother who loved him and mourned him. Though in many ways the mystery only deepened with this identification, because Ruby's story of who Donald was and why he might have come to Kansas City raised more questions than it answered. Ruby Ogletree, a respectable middle-aged woman from Birmingham, told Detective Travor that Donald had been adopted as an infant, that she and her husband had raised him as their own, had given him every advantage they could afford, had sent him to school and made sure he learned a trade and tried to set him up for a successful life. But Donald had always been a troubled child, moody and secretive, prone to bouts of depression and anxiety. And as he'd gotten older, these tendencies had intensified rather than improving, until by his early 20s he was a deeply troubled young man, paranoid and fearful, convinced that people were watching him, following him, plotting against him, though he could never or would not explain who these people were or what they wanted from him. Ruby said that Donald had worked as a telephone operator for the Southern Bell Telephone Company in Birmingham, a job that suited his temperament because it allowed him to work somewhat in isolation, connecting calls without having to engage in extensive personal interaction. And he'd been good at his job, reliable and efficient, but in the months before he disappeared, he'd started acting even more strangely, jumping at sudden noises, refusing to answer the door when visitors came to the house, spending hours locked in his room doing God knows what. And when Ruby or her husband tried to talk to him about it, tried to understand what was troubling him, he'd just say that everything was fine, that they shouldn't worry, that he was handling it, though clearly he wasn't handling it, clearly something was very wrong. In the weeks before Donald's disappearance, Ruby said he'd received several mysterious telephone calls at odd hours, late at night, early in the morning. And when Ruby answered the phone, the caller would always ask for Donald without identifying themselves. And when she asked who was calling, they would simply say a friend or someone from work and insist on speaking to him directly, and Donald would take these calls in private, closing the door to his room so she couldn't overhear. And afterward he would seem even more agitated and distressed, packing the floor, unable to sleep, clearly frightened of something, though he wouldn't tell her what. Then in early December 1934, Donald had announced that he needed to take a trip, that there were some things he needed to take care of, that he'd be gone for a while but she shouldn't worry, he'd be fine. And when Ruby pressed him for details, Where was he going? Who was he meeting? When would he be back? He'd become evasive and irritable, eventually telling her that it was better if she didn't know, that way no one could blame her for anything, and this statement had terrified her. This suggestion that he was involved in something illegal or dangerous, but before she could stop him or get more information out of him, he'd left, walking out the door with a small suitcase, and what she later discovered was all his savings withdrawn from his bank account, about $200, a substantial sum in 1935, and she hadn't seen him again, hadn't received any letters or telephone calls. Had reported him missing to the Birmingham police, who had told her that adults had the right to go where they pleased and couldn't be considered missing unless there was evidence of foul play, and she'd been waiting and worrying ever since. And now here he was, dead in Kansas City, murdered in a hotel room, and she wanted to know why, wanted to know who had killed her boy and what he'd been mixed up in that had led to this terrible end. Detective Traver questioned Ruby extensively about Donald's life, his associations, his habits, his friends and acquaintances, looking for anything that might explain why he'd come to Kansas City and who might have wanted him dead, and Ruby's answers painted a picture of a lonely, troubled young man without many close relationships, someone who kept to himself, who didn't socialize much, who seemed to live in a world of his own making, populated by fears and suspicions that might or might not have had any basis in reality. She did mention that Donald had had one close friend, someone he'd met through work, someone he'd spent time with regularly, but when Traver asked for this friend's name and details so they could interview him, Ruby became vague and evasive in a way that struck Traver as suspicious, saying only that Donald had referred to this friend as Don and that they'd been very close, almost inseparable for a period of several months. But then something had happened, Ruby wasn't sure what. Some kind of falling out or disagreement, and Donald had stopped mentioning this friend, and when Ruby asked about him, Donald had become angry and told her to drop it, to never ask about Don again, and she'd complied because she'd learned that pushing Donald when he was in one of his moods only made things worse. This information about a friend named Don immediately caught Traver's attention because of the note found in room 1046. Don, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait, and he wondered if this was the same Don, if Donald's friend was somehow involved in what had happened in Kansas City, if perhaps the note had been meant for this mysterious friend, or if perhaps the friend had written the note, or if this was all coincidence, just two common uses of a common nickname that happened to occur in proximity to each other without any actual connection. Traver pressed Ruby for more information about this friend. What was his full name? Where did he live? What did he look like? How could they find him? But Ruby genuinely seemed not to know, saying that Donald had been secretive about this friendship, had never brought the friend home to meet the family, had always met him elsewhere, and the few times Ruby had seen them together had been by chance, spotting them on the street or in a restaurant, and she'd gotten only brief glimpses of the friend. Enough to form an impression of a man in his 20s or 30s, average height and build, dark hair, nothing particularly distinctive, the kind of man who would blend into any crowd and be forgotten as soon as he walked away. Traver's investigation now had a name for the victim, Donald or Don Ogletree, assuming he'd used his adoptive family's surname, though there was also the possibility that he'd used a different name professionally or socially, and this was progress, but it didn't really answer any of the fundamental questions. Why had Donald come to Kansas City? Who had killed him? What had he been involved in that had led to such a brutal death? And what was the significance of all the theatrical elements of the crime? The unlocked door, the multiple visitors, the careful cleanup, the staged appearance of the body, all of which suggested something more than a simple murder, something more like a ritual or a performance or a message being sent to someone, though who the intended audience might be remained completely unclear. Traver sent inquiries to the Birmingham police, asking them to investigate Donald's background, his employment records, his bank accounts, his known associates, anything that might shed light on his activities in the months before he came to Kansas City. And he also asked them to try to locate the mysterious friend Don, who had been close to Donald, though without a last name or address or any identifying information beyond a physical description that fit thousands of men in Birmingham. This seemed like a nearly impossible task. The Birmingham police investigation revealed some interesting details about Donald's employment at Southern Bell. His supervisor confirmed that Donald had been a reliable employee for several years, but had become increasingly erratic in the months before he left, calling in sick frequently, making errors in his work that were uncharacteristic, seeming distracted and anxious, and he'd finally given notice in late November 1934, saying he was leaving Birmingham and moving to California, though he hadn't provided a forwarding address or any contact information. And the company had been sorry to lose him despite his recent performance issues, because when he was at his best, he was one of their more capable operators. Several of Donald's co-workers remembered him as quiet and withdrawn, not unfriendly but not sociable either, someone who kept to himself, ate lunch alone, left immediately when his shift ended, never participated in office social events or after-work gatherings. And while this behavior wasn't unusual enough to be remarkable, plenty of people preferred to keep their work and personal lives separate. It did mean that Donald had left very little impression on the people he worked with. Had formed no close friendships or significant relationships through his job, had remained essentially isolated and anonymous even in a workplace where he spent 40 or more hours per week. The investigation into Donald's finances revealed that he'd withdrawn his entire savings, approximately $200 as Ruby had said, on December 1, 1934, closing his account and taking the money in cash, and he'd also cashed his final paycheck from Southern Bell, giving him a total of about $230, and none of that money had been found in room 1046 or on his body. Meaning either that he'd spent it all during the month between leaving Birmingham and his death in Kansas City, which seemed unlikely given that hotel rooms and meals cost only a few dollars in Depression-era America, or that the money had been taken from him, either by his killer as part of a robbery or by someone else for some other reason. But if robbery had been the motive, why the torture, why the careful staging of the crime scene, why all the elaborate setup with the telephone calls and the multiple visitors and the note left for Don? Why not just kill him quickly, take the money, and leave, rather than spending hours in that hotel room inflicting pain and then carefully cleaning up afterward? One of Donald's former neighbors in Birmingham, an elderly woman named Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell who lived in the apartment next to the Ogletrees, told police that she'd seen Donald on the evening before he left Birmingham, and he'd seemed frightened, looking over his shoulder as he walked from his car to the apartment building, hurrying up the stairs instead of taking his usual leisurely pace, and when she'd called out a greeting, he'd barely acknowledged her. Just given a quick nod and disappeared into his apartment, and later that evening, around 9 or 10 o'clock, she'd heard raised voices from the Ogletree apartment, Donald arguing with someone, though she couldn't tell if the other voice belonged to Ruby or to someone else. And the argument had gone on for about 15 minutes before ending abruptly with the sound of a door slamming, and the next morning Donald had been gone, and Mrs. Hartwell had assumed he'd simply left early in the morning as he'd told his mother he would. But now, knowing how the story ended, she wondered if maybe he'd left in the middle of the night, if maybe he'd been fleeing from something or someone. If maybe that argument had been with someone who'd come to threaten him, or warn him or deliver some message that had prompted his panicked departure from Birmingham. Detective Travers assembled all this information: Ruby's account of Donald's troubled state of mind and mysterious behavior, the co-workers' descriptions of his increasing anxiety and erratic work performance, the mysterious friend named Don, the suspicious withdrawal of all his money, the possible argument on the night before he left Birmingham, and tried to construct a theory of the case that would account for all these disparate elements, but every theory he developed seemed to have fatal flaws. Gaps that couldn't be bridged, logical inconsistencies that undermined the entire framework. If Donald had been involved in criminal activity, what kind? Bootlegging was still a factor in some areas despite the repeal of prohibition in 1933. Organized crime remained active in many cities, including Kansas City, which was notorious for mob influence. There were various confidence schemes and frauds that someone might get mixed up in, but there was no evidence that Donald had connections to any criminal elements, no record of arrests or suspicious associations. Nothing to suggest he was anything other than an ordinary working-class young man with psychological issues. If he'd witnessed something criminal, perhaps overheard something during his work as a telephone operator, something that made him dangerous to some powerful individual or organization, then why hadn't he gone to the police? Why had he instead withdrawn his money and fled to Kansas City, where he checked into a hotel under false name and waited for his killers to arrive? Because surely that's what had happened. Surely he'd known they were coming, known he was going to die. And instead of running further or seeking protection, he'd simply checked into room 1046 and waited, as if death were inevitable, as if there were no point in running anymore, as if whatever he'd done or knew or represented made his death a foregone conclusion. The Kansas City Police Department held another press conference on January 12th, now able to identify the victim as Donald Ogletree of Birmingham, Alabama, and appealing for anyone who might have seen him in Kansas City between December 1st and January 4th to come forward, anyone who might have spoken with him or seen him with other people, anyone who might have any information about his activities or associations during that month. And this appeal generated a new wave of responses from the public. Several people came forward claiming to have seen Donald in Kansas City during late December and early January, and while some of these sightings were clearly cases of mistaken identity, others seemed credible and helped to fill in at least some of the blanks in Donald's final weeks. A waiter at a diner near Union Station remembered serving a man matching Donald's description on multiple occasions in late December. Always alone, always ordering the cheapest items on the menu, always sitting in a booth in the back where he could watch the door. And the waiter remembered thinking the man seemed nervous, constantly checking his watch, glancing around the restaurant as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment, and once the waiter had tried to make conversation, commenting on the cold weather or some other neutral topic, and the man had looked at him with such fear and desperation that the waiter had been taken aback and had quickly retreated, leaving him alone with his coffee and his vigil. A clerk at a Western Union office downtown remembered Donald coming in on what she thought was January 2nd, the day before he checked into the hotel president, to send a telegram, and she remembered him because he'd been so nervous, his hands shaking as he filled out the form, and she'd asked if he was all right, and he'd given her a weak smile and said yes, everything was fine, but clearly everything was not fine. And after he'd left, she'd looked at the telegram he'd sent, and had been puzzled by it.